Thank you so much for doing this interview with me and taking the time.
Oh, no worries. Just adjusting the microphone to be in a better position.
Sounds pretty good on my end.
No worries. Thank you, Dr. Michaela.
Awesome. So my first question is, you are known as a science communicator and presenter. How frustrating is it for you when, generally speaking, the media gives so much time to trivial stories and less focus is given to educating the public on the implications of climate change? Further, do you think there is a solution to this?
Getting frustrated with the media for doing that is like getting frustrated at getting wet when you walk out in a thunderstorm without an umbrella. It's the nature of the beast. It just is. If you get frustrated at it, you're just burning up unnecessary energy. It'd be better if they were better, but they're not. Also, when you talk about the news media, they are changing rapidly due to the overarching influence of both Google and Facebook, who have vacuumed up most of the advertising dollar that enabled the print and other media to do some degree of investigative reporting. Hopefully things are changing, so we'll end up with a better situation with more investigative reporting. And the other part of the question?
The other part of the question is, do you think there is a solution into getting more of the climate change stories on the news and stuff? You kind of touched on it there.
With regard to climate change, I did my first story on climate change in 1981. Were you born then?
No.
Right. So I've been doing it for a long time, and I think it's very important. So I'm continuing to do it. And in fact, I've just written a short book on climate change, which will be out at the end of March. And it basically deals with climate change from 5 simple points of view. But the bottom line is it's real. The fossil fuel companies are covering it up like big tobacco did and big alcohol. And we can not only stop global warming, we can even reverse it. The only thing stopping us is the $1 billion a year that fossil fuel is spending on telling lies about climate change. That's the only thing stopping us. And all the politicians they've bought. And there is an easy way to bypass them, but it's illegal, which is simply in the same way they've bribed the politicians, we bribe the politicians with a fraction more.
Awesome. So there seems to be an imbalance in the media where negative climate-based stories get attention and positive stories are rare and far between. Do you think this is a misrepresentation of the actual positive changes occurring across the globe?
The changes that are happening with regard to global warming are overwhelmingly negative. There are some cases where people will benefit from climate change. So, for example, Iceland has had its annual mackerel shipping tonnage go from about 6,000 tonnes to 120,000 tonnes.
Wow.
And parts of the Arctic are now being opened up to shipping, but the disadvantages far outweigh the minor advantages.
And absolutely. You mentioned before your new book. Congratulations, by the way, Dr. Karl's little book of climate change science. Can I ask you what motivated you to write this book and why you might consider writing this book to be so important?
Well, I've been writing about climate change for 4 decades. That's too long to be just writing about it. Think about, as an example, the ozone hole. So for many years we knew that CFCs were really good chemicals to have in refrigerators, and for only about a decade or two did we know that they could be possibly bad for the environment. In 1985, after decades of work, the scientists proved that CFCs were bad for the environment. Specifically, they were bad for the ozone layer. They were making it thinner. And 2 years later, the governments of the world got together and passed the Montreal Protocol and effectively started banning CFCs.
Yeah.
2 years between realising that they were bad and then banning them. With regard to climate science, it began with regard to trying to work out why the atmosphere or how the atmosphere affects the climate of our planet. Began with Fourier around 1820 by 1859, we'd shown that carbon dioxide was a warming gas. By 1.25 centuries ago, we had proven that carbon dioxide was definitely a gas that could cause warming. By 1970s and 80s, big fossil fuel was one of the major funders of real science into climate change.
Yeah.
And then everything changed around 1990. Firstly, around 1990, the scientists proved that, yes, this episode of climate change is real, and yes, we have and we are causing it via greenhouse gases in 1990. And roughly around the same time, the fossil fuel companies did a U-turn and started denying the science of climate change, and then started funding disinformation campaigns reaching about $1 billion per year by the year 2013.
Yeah.
So within 2 years of 1990, we did not effectively ban greenhouse gases. No, the fossil fuel companies had started their massive disinformation bribery campaign, and here we are 3 decades after 1990, pumping even more fossil fuels in the environment. And we've got a situation where politicians are talking about a gas-led recovery.
Mm-hmm.
Well, that's kind of stupid. So what they're talking here about is that to help the economic recovery of Australia, that we should burn lots of gas, methane, to help our industries. Well, here come 2 data points for you. First one, the amount of gas burnt by industries in Australia is a certain amount. They burn a certain amount of gas in helping them manufacture goods. That's data point number 1. Number 2, a certain amount of gas is burnt in compressing more gas for selling it overseas. Believe it or not, that number is bigger than the amount of gas we use in industry in Australia. The amount of industry in Australia that uses gases as primary fuel is microscopic.
Yeah.
We're being lied to by the politicians. We need different politicians. They're not fit for purpose.
Absolutely. As you said, because of politicians' miscommunication of science and the campaigns that fossil fuel industries did, there are certainly those who, hopefully now in the significant minority, are skeptical of climate change. You seem to consider yourself a bit of a skeptic. Is it good to be skeptical? At what point is skepticism beaten out to become an implicit fact?
Whoa, complicated. So a skeptic is somebody who says, I don't believe anything, I don't accept any science until you can prove it to me. If you can prove it to me, I accept it. So with regard to people who claim that they are climate change skeptics, I would say they're using the wrong word, because the science of climate change was already proven back in 1990. Rather, I call them gullibilists, because even though all the data is there and has been for 3 decades showing that climate change is real and that we have and are causing it, they are still gullible enough to believe the lies put out by the fossil fuel companies.
Yeah, absolutely. So climate change is thrown around like clothes in a washing machine. 1 minute the washing machine is locked and on spin, the next it is open for the clothes to be taken out. There are constant debates, especially in politics, about whether we mitigate climate change or whether we can solve/reverse climate change. What are your thoughts on this?
We've had the science and the technology to be able to bring our greenhouse emissions down to zero 10, 15 years ago. And 5, 10 years ago, we started getting the technology to reverse it. There's no new technology that has to be invented to both stop and reverse climate change. We've got everything we need. All we need to do is have the political decision to go ahead and do it. And the things that are stopping us are the decisions of the politicians who have been massively funded by the fossil fuel companies. Nothing personal. It's just business.
Recently, Scott Morrison announced his 2050 solution to go reduce Australia's carbon footprint by 2050. Do you think that this is a realistic and efficient goal, or do you think it's not efficient enough and he can be doing more realistically without detrimenting the economy of Australia?
In fact, if we were to go to a zero carbon electricity, we could do it in 10 years and the price of electricity would be 1/3 of what it is today. Why? Well, the fuel is free. Now, don't tell Scott Morrison, Andrew Bolt, Andrew Jones or Fox TV or Sky TV, but if you've got a process for making electricity and the fuel is free, it's cheaper than if you have to pay for the fuel. So my response to the official government response is words are cheap. Mm-hmm. They're not doing anything. They're trying to hold off for as long as possible. They want to keep on burning fossil fuels. And the real losers are the Australians, the 3,000 Australians who will die from air pollution as a result of burning fossil fuels, and the rest of Australia with regard to all the problems that happen. The heat waves, the bushfires, the rising ocean levels, the loss of economy. With regard to the economy, that's an interesting point. Queensland has an economy that depends upon fossil fuels, tourism and agriculture. Mm-hmm. And yet the decisions that they have made are so bad that the Bank of Sweden has sold all of its Queensland government bonds. Now, if you're not familiar with economics, let me just give you a quick update. Government bonds are normally considered to be rock solid reliable, but as part of that, you don't get a huge interest rate. But they're rock solid reliable. Not according to the Bank of Sweden. They've sold all of their Queensland government bonds. They see Queensland going for a big crash. We've got to adapt to the fact that global warming is real and we have to stop it. But instead, most of the states in Australia are just acting as though it's business as usual, heading for a precipice.
Absolutely. A lot of students my age all want to take action, but because we can't vote, we've been doing the school strikes. What do you think schools should be doing more of to ensure that the students are ready for the future?
Education is the basic role of a school, and education varies how it's brought in Australia. You're touching on a whole different problem here. Mm-hmm. Firstly, we have a major problem with education. And the problem is that the Australian government does not see education as a worthwhile investment in the future. From that follows on the next thing, which is that out of all the countries in the world that have got private schooling, Australia has the highest percentage of private schooling anywhere in the world. Yep. And Australia is probably the only country, if not the only one, where the federal government gives more money to the private companies that call themselves private schools than it does to government schools. And on one occasion, I was visiting two schools in the west of Sydney. One of them was a government school, and they'd been given $5,000 from the federal government, and they had broken windows, and out of that $5,000, they had to pay for an accountant to make sure they spent the money wisely. That afternoon, I went to a private school which had 17 cricket fields, not cricket pitches, cricket fields, and an Olympic swimming pool, and an underground rifle range. And they had just been given $3 million to build a new driveway. So when we talk about what we do about schools, step back and realise that the system is wrong in Australia with education. So we need something more like the Scandinavian model, where the teachers, to be able to teach, need a master's degree in a field, music, physical education, physics, and a degree master's degree in education. And then they get $100,000 plus. And the kids don't get any homework. And there are no private schools. So we need a system where education is seen as a worthwhile investment in the future. What we have is a fundamentally broken education system where the private schools get more money from the federal government than do the government schools.
Absolutely.
Now, what can the teachers do more? It's difficult. They're pushed 15 million away from breakfast. And I know so many schools, I've been to them, where the teachers, out of their own money, buy breakfast cereal and milk so that anything between 5 and 30% of the kids can have breakfast. So what you can do as a student is to become aware of this and start pushing for political power from people you trust. What we have in power is a bunch of parties. It varies. The Liberal Party, National Party Coalition, the Labor Party, the Greens. Many of them, most of them, are highly dysfunctional people whom you couldn't trust. There are some good people in all parties. When I ran for politics in 2007, I was really surprised by this, but there are good people in all the parties, but the majority are people who are just there to further their own ends. And they further them very nicely, thank you. What I find really distressing is somebody who calls themselves a professional politician. Mate, they're already a multimillionaire and they're going to just keep on heading down that pathway. Yeah. So we have to get rid of the politicians that we have, and you guys should start going for politics now. Tell me when you're running and I'll vote for you.
Well, thank you. Well, do you think, will Mars ever be a realistic replacement for Earth? Everyone always throws around the idea of just moving to Mars. Do you think this could actually happen?
Well, when you're looking at a cost of between $10 million and $1 million per tonne to shift stuff into orbit, and that's just into 400 kilometres from the Earth, not tens of millions of kilometres. The costs of moving to Mars are huge. So on one hand, we have to become a space-going race. On Halloween, October 30, in 2015, the human race nearly got wiped out by a rock, 600 metres in diameter, which, if it had impacted the Earth, would have wiped out between 10 and 60% of the human race, depending on where it landed. Worst possible case, a supervolcano, like Mount Etna or Yellowstone National Park and any other of 200 such sites around the world. Then you're looking at 70% death rate of everybody on Earth. And elsewhere it'd be less. Now, if we'd had 3 years warning, we could have nudged it out of the way. We had only 3 weeks. We have to become a space-going race for the survival of the planet. And the technology that we get from going into space is incredibly useful. So, thanks to GPS, slightly inebriated people on a Saturday night can navigate their way to a pizza bar to get their healthy feeling of saturated fats. And why do slightly inebriated people like saturated fats instead of fruit salad? I don't know. So should we move to Mars? We should definitely continue our space exploration. It's very cheap. Consider this. Recently, on one day, we managed to land a spacecraft on Mars, which involved hovering the spacecraft tens of meters above the surface and then dropping down a rover via a little crane while it's hovering in the air. And that crane was holding a load of 1 tonne of a 6-wheeled nuclear-powered vehicle. And we did that last week. On the same day, we had massive storms hit Texas, with the infrastructure so bad in Texas where they don't pay taxes. 68 people died, and there'll be many more dead. And some people were, thanks to their crazy system, left with electricity bills for when they did get electricity of $10,000 a day. So there are some systems that work and some that don't. In general, I prefer the systems that do work.
At times, I become frustrated by the level of ignorance and apathy in the world, particularly given that science seems to have answers to the problems humanity faces. Do you think a larger majority of people are beginning to wake up?
Are more people beginning to wake up to the real problems? It's difficult because they are too busy to keep up to date with the news, and the news has been poisoned. Let me deal with the second part first. In the old days, the media, the news media, had lots of money from advertising so they could subsidise the essential but expensive investigative reporting. The vast world budget for advertising has been vacuumed up by Facebook, Google, and even Amazon. And so there's very little left for the standard media. And not many people are paying attention to the news media anyway. So that leads me to the first point. Because not that many people are paying attention to the media because they're working so long. When I was a kid, a person could provide for a family by one adult working in a job full-time, and full-time was either 37 and a half hours a week or 40, and that was it. And out of that 37 and a half or 40 hours a week, you could have enough money to buy a house, a car, and go on a holiday each year. Nowadays, you've got less money around and available to the poor people, and more of it's filtering up to the wealthy. So we're not seeing a trickle-down economy, we're seeing it being sucked up. And more money is leaving the hands of the poor and going to the wealthy. And the poor people are working, I know people who work 3 jobs between 2 adults, and they can't afford to buy a house, and they're going flat out. And as for the luxury of reading the newspapers and following the media and being aware, forget it, man. They're just little worker robots who are working all the time. They just don't have that luxury. So I've written a story about this in one of my books, talking about the money flowing upwards. As an example, in America, during the COVID-19 financial crisis, which is pandemic and financial crisis, some people did so well that instead of the normal 2 or 3 billion years a year being created, 20. So the people at the top are getting very wealthy, and the people at the bottom are getting poorer. And that means you.
Yeah.
But as far as they're concerned, it's nothing personal, it's just business.
Absolutely. So with what
they need to be fixed. You need to get different politicians. The system is broken.
Yeah. With what you were saying about finances and also climate change as a whole, what does the world look like to you in 2040?
I'm reminded of the words of a Nobel Prize winner. It is very difficult to make predictions, especially about the future.
Yep.
What happens in 2040 is what you decide to do over the next couple of years. I don't know what you're going to do.
So I'm interviewing Dr. Joel Pedro, the lead project scientist of the Million Year Ice Core project, for another interview. I want him to help explain to people how information from ice cores tells us so much about the Earth's climate history and why it's relevant to current anthropogenic climate change. Are there any other places we can get information from? And if so, can you help explain this, like where we can get our information from?
Well, let me try and zone in on one thing. So he's involved with the Million Year Ice Core from Antarctica. Am I correct?
Yes.
Has anybody explained the Milankovitch cycles?
No.
Let me start. So we're in a series of ice ages right now. And there were some about 150 million years ago, 300 million years ago, 450, 600 million years ago, we were in a snowball Earth. And there's a bunch of factors involved in tipping the Earth off into an ice age. Firstly, what is an ice age? The word has different meanings, but let's just stick to plain English. So during an ice age, the ice is 1 kilometre thick over New York, 3 kilometres thick over Montreal. There's glaciers up and down the east coast of Australia. And to make all this ice, to get this ice onto land, means the water has to come from somewhere, and it comes out of the oceans.
Yeah.
And the oceans drop down by 80, 100, 120 metres. And it's thought that Milankovitch cycles are involved. Milankovitch, Milankovitch. There's different spellings because you're translating from a Cyrillic language into a Latin-based Roman language. Milankovitch, a Serbian astronomer of the 1920s. And he reckoned that a variation of 3 factors in the orbit of the Earth caused these ice ages, and that's where this million-year ice core comes in. So, ice ages began about, let's say, 3 million years ago, roughly. And so from 3 million years ago to 2 million years ago to 1 million years ago, there's a whole bunch of ice ages which had a certain characteristic. They would come for about 41,000 years, go away for about 10,000 years, come for 41,000 years, go away for about 10,000 years, and they kept on repeating from about 3 million years ago to about 1 million years ago. And then suddenly, 1 million years ago, they changed. 100,000 years of ice age, 20,000 years of not ice age. 100,000, 20, 100,000, and we came out of the last ice age about 18,000 years ago, 15,000 years ago, and we were going to plunge into another ice age in the next 5,000 years or so, but we have unfortunately stopped that with global warming. Fortunately, unfortunately, there's a middle path. So where does Milankovitch come into this and the million-year ice core? Here's a question. Why did the Earth flip from a 41,000-year-long ice age to a 100,000-year ice age? And the answer is, we don't know, but the secret might be in ice 1 million years old. Remember, that flipped about 1 million years ago from 41,000-year cycles into 100,000-year cycles. Now, let's do a little detour. We'll come back to this, and let's dive into what exactly are the Milankovitch cycles. There are 3 of them. The first one is that as the Earth goes around the sun, the Earth, so we'll pretend that this is the sun, and here is the Earth going around it. Vaguely circular. It switches from elliptical to circular to elliptical every 100,000 years. So the orbit of the Earth switches from elliptical to circular to elliptical every 100,000 years. That ties in with a 100,000-year ice age cycle. Secondly, the Earth is tilted. It's currently tilted at around 23.5 degrees. And over a 42,000 year cycle, remember that number, 41,000, 42,000 cycles, it rocks gently from 24.5 down to 21.5. At the moment, it's at 23.5 heading down. And the third thing is that as the Earth is going around the sun, tilted at this angle, so it's always rocking backwards and forwards on a 41,000 year cycle, and the orbit is going circular elliptical on a 100,000 year cycle. Another thing happens on 24,000 year cycle, which is this. Gradually, the north-south axis of the Earth spins out a complete circle over a 24,000 year cycle. So the question is, putting it all back together, why did the Earth's ice ages flip from a 100,000 year cycle from 3 million years ago to 1 million years ago to a 41,000 year cycle 1 million years ago to the present? Why did they flip over 1 million years ago? We think from modelling, we think that the answer lies in carbon dioxide levels changing. And how are we going to find out? By getting this million-year-old ice. It's the oldest ice on the planet. The Antarctic is a giant ice cream cone, maybe 10 million kilometres square, doubling in winter, shrinking, doubling, and the ice flows slowly, and the oldest ice we reckon is about 1 million years old. And so we're going, the scientists in the Antarctic are going inland to go and get some of this ice. Now, I would suggest some people that you could talk to in the Australian Antarctic Division who are involved with this. And one of them is the woman who's the team leader, Sharon, who is in charge of the lives of a couple of dozen people for a couple of dozen days as she drives a string of tractors inland from the coast to where they want to do the drilling. Now, you've got one enormous Challenger tractor. They're huge things with big rubber treads, and they're towing a string of sleds behind them, a couple of 100 tonnes, and there's a couple of these tractors. And sometimes they're going through perfectly sunny weather, and sometimes they can't see 3 metres from their face. And going flat out in a 12-hour day, they'll do maybe 100 kilometres. And then they sleep, and they do it again the next day. And the trouble is that the ice is not dead smooth. It's bumpy. Now, I don't know if you've heard this word. I've never heard of it before. Here it comes. Sastrugi. Have you ever heard that word before?
No.
Sastrugi refers to ripples in the ice that are very hard. It's like driving on a very badly corrugated road. So right at the beginning of each of the three tractor trains is a very specialised hand-built machine. They make them by hand. And if you've got these ripples going like that, what the operator has to do with a kind of bulldozer blade is just skim. Not too high, not too low, just skim so you can pick off the ice off the top and dump it into the valleys, leaving behind a smoother pathway. And she knows that the engine is running because she can hear the bloody thing. It's really noisy. And she can hear the tacho going. But the way that she knows that she's going forward is only, not the speedo, because the tracks could be just spinning. It's the GPS. And there have been occasions when she's driving in a snowstorm, this is Shazza, and she's the lead skimmer vehicle. She told me this story when I was down in the Antarctic last time, and she's at Casey Base Station, and the blade, instead of being here, is there, and it's stuck into the ice, and the engine's turning and the tracks are spinning and she's not going anywhere. And the only way that she knows that she's not moving forward, because there's a whiteout. Everything more than 2 metres away is just white. She can't even see the front of the tractor. And when I say tractor, it's a huge thing, enormous. And she can just see that the GPS is not moving, and then she knows that she's bogged. And then she has to radio everybody and tell them to stop, and then they have to go out in this snowstorm, in this blizzard, and then clean it. I got stuck in a blizzard down there, and instead of coming back, I got stuck. And so we stayed there for another week, and the wind was easily hitting 168 kilometres an hour. So you talk to Shazza and get the human story behind all of this.
I'd love to talk to
does
her.
that give you a bit of a background to
that does.
why they're looking for this million-year-old ice?
Absolutely. So I have one more question for you. What do you think is the greatest misconception
Sure.
on climate change science that the society has?
The greatest misconception on climate change varies depending on what particular lies big fossil fuel are putting out at the time. Take, for example, big tobacco. They're still putting up the line that tobacco, it hasn't been proven that smoking tobacco is bad for your health. Take big alcohol. 2 years ago, in August, in every hospital in Australia, a huge sign, a big A0 sign, not A3, not A2, not A1, but A0 sign appeared in every hospital in Australia with a picture of a pregnant woman, sideways, without a head, because of the patriarchy. And underneath the picture of the pregnant woman sideways, there were 3 paragraphs. And the first paragraph said, it has not been proven that it is dangerous for a pregnant woman to drink alcohol with regard to the health of her unborn baby.
That's
That's a
absurd.
complete lie. We've known for half a century that that's a lie. Now, you can't blame big alcohol because they've got no morals. And you see, they just want to sell alcohol. Nothing personal, it's just business. And they're doing okay, but there's this small subset of society called pregnant women who are just refusing to drink alcohol and cutting into their potential profits. So they put out these posters in every hospital in Australia telling lies. Nothing personal, it's just business. As soon as the doctors noticed and the nursing staff and everybody else, they pulled them down straight away and replaced it with a different one, moving right along. In the same way, big fossil fuel has been coming out with different lies, depending. First lie, the Earth is not warming up. There's no such thing as global warming. Then, a little bit later, they changed that to, yeah, there is global warming, but it's just totally natural. Nothing to do with us. Happened before, will happen again. Third lie, global warming is happening, and it is caused by us, but it's not bad. It's actually good. It means that you won't have to wear so many jumpers in winter. Fourth lie, there is global warming. It was caused by us, and it's going to be bad, but it's too late to do anything about it. Fifth lie, they're doing right now. So they're keeping the fourth one. Yeah, global warming is real. Yeah, we cause it. Fossil greenhouse gases cause it. But they're keeping, it's too late to do anything about it, combined with trying to push your energy off into the wrong areas. So really, we should move towards a gas-led recovery, or we should move towards carbon capture. So they're trying to say, oh, look, we're right on board with stopping global warming, and why don't we suggest these ideas that won't work so we can still keep on selling fossil fuels, because all we want to do is sell fossil fuels. And by the way, with regard to fossil fuels, here's two items of data. With regard to gas mining, and then so you mine for the gas, you explore for the gas, you mine it and you extract it. People think that employs 10% of Australia's population. No, 0.2%.
Wow.
Second thing about fossil fuels. When the fossil fuels, the gas, the coal, the oil, is taken out from underground and then passed on, there's a revenue, there's some sort of income stream that goes to various governments around Australia. People think it's around 10% of Australia's GDP. It's 0.2%. It's nothing. Third factor, fossil fuel companies get subsidies. There's a report by the International Monetary Fund in 2019 talking about fossil fuel subsidies. Now, a subsidy is different from an investment. If I happen to invest in your future, I'll give you $20,000 and I'll say, when you start earning money, I want $22,000 back. Mm-hmm. But if I give a subsidy, I just say, here's $22,000, take it, it's yours. Mm-hmm. At the moment, the subsidies paid to fossil fuel companies around the world add up to 8% of the entire world's government's revenue. So 8% out of every dollar that the governments in the world gets given to fossil fuel companies as a present. Here's a question. When was the last time you saw a fossil fuel company running a Lamington sale at your local primary school on Saturday morning? Never. When the head of Exxon, one of the biggest fossil fuel companies in the world, left his position after many years of denying climate science, he left with a bonus. Question for you without notice, Dr. Michaela. How much was the bonus that the head of Exxon got when he left? Pick a number.
20 million.
20 million. Ha! 400 million. So we're in the situation where a few dozen companies are making massive profits and everybody on earth is suffering. So a small number of companies can make massive profits. This is all in my latest book, Climate Science with Dr. Karl, 15,000 words. And the bottom line is that the politicians are not fit for purpose. Nothing personal. You don't do anything bad to them, just vote them out and they can get a real job. I kind of like the Greek system where they had a lottery. And so anybody in the street who is a free person could become a politician. And if you did okay, well, you're okay. And if you did badly, they killed you. Nothing personal. You just shouldn't do bad things for the country.
I definitely think people should read your book. It's very...
No comment or question?
No comment or question. I'll leave that one.
Okay, I'll give you the summary of the book now, just to fit.
Absolutely.
Here's my fine book. I'll give you a summary. It's in 5 parts. Part number 1. We've been doing the science of climate change since 1820. The fossil fuel companies provided a lot of the funding to do good science in the 1970s and 80s. And then in the 1990s, 2 things happened. Firstly, we realised the scientists proved that global warming was real and caused by us. And secondly, the fossil fuel companies started denying it to the tune of $1 billion a year by 2013. Secondly, why did we ever burn fossil fuels? And the answer is they're just loaded with energy. Think about a labourer. And you've got that labourer and they're getting bricks and they're taking the bricks from here and they're lifting them up. And that requires energy, gravitational potential. So you're working with them flat out. How long does it take for a labourer to work, doing just straight energy, shifting things from here to there, to equal the energy in a barrel of oil? And the answer is 10 years. Now you can buy a barrel of oil, 159 litres, for $50. Do you want to buy a labourer's labour for 10 years? That's $500,000. Which one's cheaper, 50 or 500,000? So there you go. And if you burn that oil slowly over 10 years, you've saved yourself $499,950. But if you burn up a barrel of oil, say 2 or 3 barrels of oil every minute, then you can shift 500 people at 900 kilometres an hour from Australia to Europe, because that's how much energy a jet burns. That's why we're burning fossil fuels. They're loaded with energy. Number 3, where does the heat of global warming come from? It's not from actually burning the fuel, it's the heat trapped from the sun. How much heat? 400,000 Hiroshima bombs per day. Not per decade, per day. So what happens is the sun puts out heat, and this is at a short wavelength, 700 to 3,000 nanometers. And that heat goes straight past the greenhouse gases, goes straight through them, doesn't even do anything with them. Hits the ground, warms the ground up, is re-radiated back into space at a longer wavelength, about 10,000 nanometers, and at that longer wavelength interacts with the greenhouse gases, is absorbed and sent back down to the ground. How much heat is sent down to the ground? 400,000 Hiroshima bombs per day. You can get away with that amount of heating for a day, or a week, or a month, or a year, or a decade, but do it for several decades and suddenly you find you've got a heat wave in Europe that kills 70,000 people. You have the biggest bushfires in Australia ever. You have the ocean currents changing, so suddenly the fish are going in different pathways. You're getting massive storms hitting more often. This is what's happening. Third thing, what's happening? Fourth thing, third one. So the effects of global warming, on top of all the effects I've mentioned, like massive storms, etc., we have also, wait for it, we've tipped the Earth off its axis. So the Earth spins on a north-south axis, but this spin, this north-south axis has been gradually migrating towards the equator at about 6 to 7 centimetres a year. But we've been melting ice. Last year it was somewhere between 750 million tonnes of ice and 1.5 billion tonnes of ice. And that ice is mostly the poles and then comes down to sea level and then migrates towards the equator. And tip the Earth off its axis a little bit. So now, instead of the north-south axis of the Earth moving towards the equator at 6 to 7 centimetres a year, suddenly it is now going parallel to the equator and accelerate up to 26 centimetres a year. Isn't it amazing to think that we've been able to change the orbital spin of a body 12,700 kilometres in diameter? Where is this global warming coming from? From which countries? Well, at the moment, China is the biggest producer, followed closely by the United States and Europe. But overall, the biggest contributor to greenhouse emissions is firstly Europe, followed by the USA, followed by China, because they've been doing it longer. And fifthly, we can stop and reverse global warming, and anything stopping us is $1 billion a year that you get by buying politicians money from fossil fuel companies combined with their false advertising. That's the summary of this book.
That sounds amazing. I know I'm going to check it out, and I hope that everyone else does too. So thank you so much for doing this interview with me. I learned so much, and thank you for taking the time to do it.